Everyone. I'm Winnie Borden, Chair of Circle Studies, and I'm pleased that we have such a wonderful and unique program this morning. I want to thank Ellen Bernard for her work in coordinating this program and bringing a special opportunity to us to learn about trauma and ways that trauma can be mitigated. I want to thank Carol Yoder and Susan Manikin for their support and guidance in setting this program up. And I want to thank Ellen Bernard for all the work that she did in putting it together. And that is the end of my remarks. I'm turning this over to Ellen Bernard right now.
You don't want to hear it? I think I want to hear it.
John, just put your slippers on.
Winnie Borden, remember?
Can I say me?
Winnie Borden, no.
Hi, thank you, Winnie. And could everyone please be sure that they're on mute? Thank you. I want to welcome Councilman Zeke Cohen, Ali and Ottman Smith, and Dr. Tara Doty, who are joining us today to talk about Healing City and how they and others are working to make Baltimore a trauma-informed city focused on community-centered healing. Zeke Cohen has represented the 1st District of the City of Baltimore on the City Council since 2016. Zeke has been dedicated to trauma-informed care and introduced the Elijah Cummings Healing City Act in 2019, making Baltimore the first city in the country to legislate trauma-responsive care. The bill, which was signed into law in February 2020, and the Healing City Baltimore movement that propelled it forward were created in partnership with community members across Baltimore to help Baltimore heal from our enduring legacies of trauma, racism, and violence. Brothers Ali and Ottman Smith founded Holistic Life Foundation in 2001 to provide programs for underserved youth living in the same Baltimore community they grew up in. They began teaching yoga and mindfulness practices to at-risk youth. Holistic Life Foundation has served more than 100,000 youth and adults through yoga, mindfulness, and environmentally based programs in trauma-informed training. Dr. Tara Doty obtained her doctoral degree in clinical psychology from Howard University and founded the Sage Wellness Group, a national consulting firm committed to using a trauma-informed and responsive lens to assist agencies in improving services provided to children and families. They use a strengths-based approach and work with schools, social service agencies, hospitals, nonprofit, and city and state agencies. Sage Wellness Group focuses on educating on restorative practices, trauma-informed care, equity, mindfulness, parenting, understanding the clinical impacts of addiction, and ethics. We are so grateful that you're with us this morning. Thank you. Just one little housekeeping moment that we'll take questions after the presentations, but feel free to take advantage of the chat to jot down any questions you might have and we'll get to them, or raise your hand during the question and answer period. But please keep your microphones muted during the presentation. And Councilman Cohen, I will turn the program over to you.
Well, thank you so much, Ellen. My dear friend, Ellen Bernard, appreciate the kind introduction, and thank you to all of you for having us. It is great to be back at the Baltimore Women's Giving Circle. I haven't been here in a few years since I was in a previous life as a nonprofit director, but it is so good to be back virtually. As Ellen mentioned, I'm Zeke Cohen. I was the lead sponsor of the Healing City Act, and I'm going to tell you a bit about that bill today. And is it possible to tee up the PowerPoint? Awesome. Appreciate you. And I will just also mention briefly that we are in the process of bringing a new director on. We are really, really excited about Kim, who's going to be joining us in about 2 weeks to lead the work of Healing City. Excited to share with you today about what we've been up to and where we are headed, and also truly excited to have you hear from Tara and Ali and Ottman.
Zeke, can you just say next slide so I know what you need?
Sure. I actually can't see the slides. Is it loading for?
And it looks like it's still loading.
Sorry, did anybody else see it? I was sharing it with my screen. I saw it. Did no one else?
No.
Oh,
Yeah, we can
okay.
just see
Hang
the
on one second.
Yeah, and the screen we see just says it's loading.
Oh, hold please. Hang on. Oh, isn't that interesting?
Oh, God.
Hang on. Let me try again.
And I'm just gonna get started since I know we're gonna be tight on time. So the work for Healing City really started in 2019 when, unfortunately, Baltimore suffered a school shooting where a gentleman walked into Frederick Douglass High School with a gun and shot one of our school staff. Oh, there you go. Looks like you got it.
Okay, I'll see if I can actually make it bigger so you don't have to see all this stuff. If it goes away, let me know.
Perfect. I think if you, yeah, there you go.
Is it there?
No, we're back to.
Yeah, see, when I make it big, well, that's where we have our problem. You may just have to, can you see it now?
No, oh,
Yes.
there. Yep, perfect. All right, let's just do that.
Yeah.
All right.
Okay.
So if you could go to slide 3, that would be great. One more. Perfect. So as I mentioned, there was a shooting at Frederick Douglass High School. It was during school hours. It did not make national news, but for the children that were there at the time, it was incredibly traumatic. And young people described having to duck behind desks, hearing the sounds of gunfire in the hallway, seeing a beloved school staff member shot. And it was just a really devastating experience. Next slide, please. And so we decided to hold a hearing in the city council focused on youth voices, youth violence. And the idea was to hear directly from young people who had been there at the time about what we could do collectively to reduce their exposure to gun violence. And so the 3 young folks you see in front of you, if you could just go back, that is Damani on the microphone, Jayana and Brianna. They were juniors at the time. And when they got to the mic, what they wanted us to focus on was not a new plan for how to police them or their school, but how we could actually prevent this type of violence from occurring. And they went through and named every single ACE, which I think Tara may talk about a little later, but which means adverse childhood experience in the book. They spoke about their own exposure to food insecurity, homelessness, having a family member who struggles with substance use disorder. They spoke about just growing up Black in the city that was one of the birthplaces of racial redlining and what that does psychologically to your soul. And they said to us, that's what you, the city council, need to focus on. Not hardening our school, making it more metal detectors, but addressing the trauma, the day-to-day adverse childhood experiences that we go through. And for me, as a former teacher, that really resonated because I used to see that with my students as well. And so after the hearing, I went up to these 3 young folks and said, listen, I think what you said was incredibly poignant. And instead of me just going back and writing a bill, why don't we actually work on it together? Because I think that what we can come up with will be so much stronger informed by your voices. Next slide, please. And so we set out to do a listening tour across the entire city of Baltimore. We heard from hundreds and hundreds of people in libraries, in rec centers, in classrooms, all across the city. And what we heard was this theme that And you all know this because you're the Women's Giving Circle. Baltimore, while we have a lot of pain and a lot of trauma, we also have so much healing that's happening in our communities. But too often it's happening in silos. Part of what I love about the Women's Giving Circle is you all are working together to really dig in on these issues, but we don't do that enough in Baltimore. And so people said, we need a movement for healing, and we need you, Zeke, to really plant a flag and use your power as a legislator to address this issue. Because too often city government has created trauma in our communities and then leaves it to other people to clean up the mess. So you've got to legislate and take the lead on this issue. Next slide, please. About a year later, we got together at Morgan State University, which is one of our 2 HBCUs in Baltimore, historically Black college and universities, and we held a youth healing summit. The young people spoke about what it was like to grow up with trauma, but also how to heal from it. We did TED Talks and poetry. Next slide, please. This young woman was the MC. She read an incredibly powerful poem about her own experiences, and then she quite literally dropped the mic, and it was very powerful. Next slide, please. The next day, we went over to Coppin State, which is our other HBCU, and we held a community healing summit. And we had all sorts of organizations, folks that you all know, like Roberta's House and Center for Urban Families. We had educators, physicians, and we had these barbers and beauticians giving out free haircuts. All these people who we'd spoken to on our listening tour. And what was interesting for me, hearing from particularly this West Baltimore barber, a guy named Troy Stanton, who said, you know, Zeke, in our community, barbers are actually healers. Because when people come into the barber shop, they're honest, they're vulnerable, they're able to have really difficult conversations. And this is a guy who, Troy, was shot in his own barbershop, survived the shooting, went on to create an organization called More Than a Shop, where he teaches barbers to help folks get medical care, get resources. And the thing that Troy said to me is, you know, the act of giving someone a haircut, that touch is incredibly healing. And we touch both the victims of violence, but we also touch the shooters, the people who are using their gun for nefarious purposes. And you never know whether that haircut that you gave and that conversation that you held may have prevented someone from going out and using their gun. And so make sure that barbers and beauticians are part of this intervention as well. And so we did. Next slide, please. And then we collectively marched as a community over back to Frederick Douglass High School. Next slide, please. Where the young people, Brianna, Gianna, and Damani, spoke about what it was like not just to have been through this horrific experience, this school shooting, but to have actually taken their power back and written a bill, written real legislation to try to bring healing to our city, and advocated and fought for it. Next slide, please. And then Mayor Jack Young, who was the mayor at the time, signed the Elijah Cummings Healing City Act, thus making Baltimore the first city in America to have legislated trauma-informed care. Next slide, please. And that was right there at their high school. And it was a very proud and powerful moment. What our bill does is that it creates a task force of 38 people from all different fields, everyone from students to educators to physicians to nonprofit folks to returning citizens who've been incarcerated, who are part of a citywide task force who address and identify ways in which we can reduce trauma in our city. The other thing our bill does is it calls for training of all of our city agencies on trauma-informed care. Tara is going to share a little more deeply what that looks like, but we want to make sure that when you step into a library, when you step into a rec center, when you step into a Baltimore city government building, that the folks in that building understand the impact of trauma on the brain, understand what it does, and have some ways to support people who have been through it. And then finally, our bill calls for a review of all policies and procedures within our city agencies. Next slide, please. This is an image of our task force being sworn in. We passed the bill, and then a few days later, the mayor announced that this pandemic called COVID was happening. And so everyone had to pivot and go virtual and hold everything either virtual or outside. But an amazing group of Baltimoreans coming together to become the city's trauma-informed care task force. Next slide, please. So this is our training staff. This is our faculty, and it is led by the great Dr. Tara Doherty, who you're going to hear from soon. But what we wanted to do is make sure that everyone who taught these practices was a Baltimorean, so that we could actually learn from the wisdom that already exists within our city. Folks said to us, don't go to New York or DC to go teach Baltimore about how to heal from trauma. We have amazing experience within our own city. You just need to tap into it. And so folks like Ali and Ottman Smith, who you're going to hear from later, who teach us about mindfulness, which is an evidence-based practice to help folks heal from trauma. Folks like Annette March Greer, the incredible founder of Roberta's House, who runs literally the country's premier grief counseling center, teaches our folks about grief, because we know that we're a city that loses 300 plus people a year from homicide and almost 3 times that many from overdose deaths. Folks like the Youth Healing Alliance, the Healing Youth Alliance, who are young people that teach children and other adults how to engage conversations with teenagers about healing from trauma. Next slide, please. This was an article in The Trace. Baltimore bets on a new type of first responder, the librarian. We decided to start our trainings in our library system. Folks on this call will know that Enoch Pratt Free Library is one of the best library systems in the world, and that is not just a place to go get books, although that is where I take my daughter every other week to get our 10 library books, but it's also a place where people go to connect with resources. Folks will go to the library to help find housing or get on the internet. It's also a place where people who've experienced a lot of trauma spend a lot of time. We see our neighbors who are experiencing homelessness in the library, folks who are struggling with substance use. So we wanted to start there, and we wanted to train everyone from librarians, our secretary staff, security guards in these practices. Next slide, please. After we got done training the library system, we went through this policy review where we looked at all the ways in which we, city government, may inadvertently be causing trauma in our communities. And one of the policies that the head librarian, Heidi Daniel, lifted up is she said, I don't think we should have a zero tolerance policy for anyone that is struggling with addiction, because the policy had been that anyone who seemed like they may have used drugs or alcohol within the last 24 hours was to be immediately written up and kicked out. And she said, we know in the year 2022, which is when we did these trainings, that addiction is actually a disease, that it is a mental health disorder. And so to treat it by just kicking people out or criminalizing their behavior is wrong. And it's certainly not trauma informed. And so she got rid of that policy, and she instead brought peer recovery coaches into our libraries. These are folks who themselves have actively struggled with addiction, but are on the other side, and who are able to support other people who are going through it. And they're positioned and deployed. We started in Penn North, which is sort of the epicenter of the opioid crisis for Baltimore. But through a grant from Care First, we are now going to be in 8 other branches across the city. And they help people get into treatment. They help people connect with housing. Whatever the resource you need, that's what they're going to provide. Next slide, please. We took our legislation statewide. We were really proud to pass the Healing Maryland's Trauma Act, sponsored by Senator Jill Carter and Delegate Robin Lewis. And we look forward to partnering with Governor Wes Moore, who is a huge advocate for this work, on implementing that bill. Next slide, please. Finally, our results. We passed legislation making Baltimore the first city in America to be trauma-informed by law. We have trained our mayor, our city agency heads, our city council members and staff. We've trained our library system. Beginning this month, we are training Baltimore City Recreation and Parks, and we are partnering with a researcher from the Bloomberg School of Public Health to study and evaluate the efficacy of this work. I am truly excited that Baltimore is the first city in America to be doing this. We have had interest from Pittsburgh and Philadelphia and San Jose in California, Savannah, Georgia. A number of cities have seen what Baltimore has started to do and are interested, and we have been supporting them as well. So with that, I am incredibly excited to pass the mic to my good friend, Dr. Tara Daugherty, who leads our trainings through Sage Wellness.
Thank you, Councilman Cohen. Good morning, everyone. I don't need the slide presentation, so you're welcome to turn it down, or we can look at the results while I talk. So that also works for me. I am Dr. Tara. I'm the founder and CEO of Sage Wellness Group. And just really quickly, I want to also acknowledge our trauma-informed care coordinator, Ms. Dominique Clifton, who's also on this call, who is also just a huge asset to this project and this process. One of the things that I'm very, very clear about in talking about trauma is that it is a process, it's a journey. I try as often as I can not to call it work, because work means it's finite, but this is a process. And so many of us have heard about post-traumatic stress disorder, and not enough people have heard about post-traumatic recovery. And our approach at Sage Wellness Group, and especially in our partnership with the Healing City Act and the Baltimore City Health Department, are really working to make sure that our role as the project manager for this process very heavily focuses on the recovery part of trauma. As Councilman Cohen talked about, we are a national organization that really operates from the universal trauma-informed care belief that states that every person that you meet has been impacted by something that they would consider to be traumatic. It's not my role to diagnose people's trauma. It's also not even my role to know what it is. What it is my role and responsibility to do is to recognize the behaviors. One of the things that Councilman Cohen mentioned is the importance of peer recovery specialists in our library system, recognizing that addiction is a disease. One of the things that people also oftentimes don't recognize is that for many people, addiction is a coping skill to cope with the types of trauma that they have experienced. And so when we look at trauma throughout the lifespan. We know that trauma literally impacts a woman while she's pregnant, increasing her cortisol levels, making her more likely to go into preterm labor. We know that adverse childhood experiences are grouped into 3 categories: the experiences of abuse, neglect, and or household challenges or dysfunction experienced before the ages of 18. And then we also know that through work such as mindfulness and restorative practices, the brain can actually be rewired to create new pathways so that healing can occur and healing can be sustained. And so I just want to pre-acknowledge Ali and Atman of Holistic Life Foundation, who will speak more about the healing process of trauma. So many times we focus on the traumatic events, some of which people don't remember, some of which people are not able to talk about, versus the healing components of that. And we believe that healing is possible. And so when we think about what Sage Wellness Group has done so far with the Healing City Act and working with our city agencies, similar to what Zeke said, we started with the library system, and Sage Wellness Group uses a twofold approach, meaning that in addition to doing trainings and workshops, it's also... Did you mean to mute me? Did someone want to speak out?
I did not. I'm sorry. That was my mistake.
No problem. One of the things that is important when we train agencies, trainings and workshops are wonderful. However, a training and workshop does not equate to an agency being trauma informed. A training and workshop does not equate to an agency having the awareness, knowledge, and skill of using trauma informed approaches. And so what is so important for us then becomes what becomes an agency's implementation plan? What becomes their sustainability plan? And so that means that we work with leadership of these agencies. We've provided executive coaching. We did listening sessions with the library. We began to look at their policies and procedures to make sure that policies and procedures are written from a person-centered approach, which means that you give people dignity, right? So for example, instead of saying that homeless people are in our libraries, that's the issue first, the person is second, we say individuals or people who are experiencing homelessness. And so we allow people to be first and centered in our conversations with how we approach them and how we talk about them internally. The second thing that we also recognize is that trauma does not care about our positions and or our titles. And so just because we are working within a city agency, that does not exclude us from having our own experiences with trauma. And so part of our process is what is known as a parallel process. And so while we are working with library administration or agency administration to support the communities that they serve, we're also working with them to increase their own emotional intelligence, their own emotional and self-awareness to support their staff, many of whom live in these very same communities that have been impacted by community violence, by race-based trauma, and how they then create an atmosphere where their staff feel safe enough to express when they need a mental health day, when they need to take a moment to have a mindful moment in the middle of a meeting. And so we really work to make sure that trauma-informed approaches are seen as relational versus transactional. It's great if an organization does 10 trainings. It's not so great if no one remembers what the objectives were or they no longer have the skills to implement it. And so one of the things that we want to make sure that we are doing and understanding in our process is understanding who are the people that are being served by these communities. Similar to the library system, our Rex and Park system is largely both run and utilized by female-headed or women-headed households. And so we want to understand the importance and the impact of post-traumatic recovery that it has on households, that it has on the staff within the rec centers and also the families that utilize it. One of the things that I think struck me during our time in these trainings was the amount of staff that while we were talking about how to make the agencies a safer space, or the agencies use language that is transparent, which breeds trustworthiness. How many staff reached out in the middle of these trainings to me to say, you know, I've experienced this. I never knew that this was traumatic. One of the things that the brain does that many of you may know is that, you know, the brain's job is to keep us alive. And so if I'm a person who has experienced chronic or complex trauma, that means that the brain never has a chance to kind of return to that baseline, right? So ideally, when we experience trauma or stress, there's the peak period and then the body has a chance to calm down. Our central nervous system has a chance to reset and our emotions have a chance to regulate. When we live in communities where community violence is a norm, right? Or families, can everyone mute themselves if you're not muted? Or we live in households where domestic violence is present. What that means is that the nervous system is oftentimes dysregulated. The nervous system is often operating at a state of fight, flight, or being frozen. And so when we talk about, and so what that does to the brain is that the brain normalizes it. This is how people communicate when they're angry. This is how people communicate when they're scared. This is how people communicate when they're excited. And so part of this process is, one, introducing concepts of how trauma impacts the body, how trauma impacts the brain, how trauma impacts our health. And then most importantly, introducing ways to get the body to calm down, ways for us to honor that brain-body connection that so many people, so many survivors of trauma have been taught to ignore, right? This doesn't feel safe, but I have to keep going through it. I think practices such as mindfulness, which Ali and Ottman will talk about, give people permission to give themselves permission to tap into what their bodies are saying what their bodies need in the moment, and recognizing very short and tangible and practical ways to give the body what it needs in order to release some of the trauma, some of the tension that it has been holding. And so that is just a very, very brief snapshot of what we do. And then I think the important thing also is when we look at the healing from trauma, we know that so many people talk about trauma being intergenerational, right? So we know that it can be passed down through DNA, and it can be passed down through parenting practices, it can be passed down through relationship practices. What we also want to emphasize, and for me, overemphasize, is that healing can also be generational, right? Healing can also be passed down through parenting practices. And as we heal the parents, as we heal the families, we are also setting up ourselves to heal. We think about generations of future Baltimoreans. And so I then am excited to turn it over to Ali and Atman of Holistic Life Foundation, where they will talk about what they do internationally and then more specifically within this legislation. Or am I turning it back over to you, Zeke? Or okay, Ali and Atman, take it away.
All right. Thank you, Zeke, for passing this legislation. Thank you, Tara, for the intro, and as always, the information that you gave to everyone today. Ali will dive deeper into what Holistic Life Foundation does for the past 21 years in Baltimore and worldwide. But I'm gonna jump into a practice. So if everyone could maybe move to the edge of your seat, have your feet grounded. And if you could maybe grab your right ankle and bring your leg behind your head. Just kidding. I like to keep it light. Like we always joke with that, but like honestly, the physical practices is really important in what we do, because trauma does get stored in the body. Maybe not putting your leg behind your head, but some of the other poses that we do helps release that trauma that's stored in the body. But as Tara said, there are so many different ways to return the baseline or make the body feel safe. A lot of ways is like different meditations. People can meditate on with a singing bowl or candle gazing and stuff like that, but nobody really takes a singing bowl with them or has a lit candle in their pocket. But one thing they always do have with them is their breath. Their breath is portable. And if you can use that as a tool to kind of achieve inner peace, that's something that's with you for the rest of your life, and no one can take that from you. It's like empowering to learn how to do that. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to do a meditation on the breath. So for real this time, if you could, feet grounded, back, neck, and head aligned. I invite you or welcome you to close your eyes if you feel comfortable enough. If you don't, you can just soften your gaze, close your eyes 9/10 of the way, or you can keep your eyes open, focusing on a point, but recommend that you do close your eyes because it limits your distractions. We're going to take a couple deep breaths together, all in and out through our nose, just to get grounded. So everyone inhale long, slow, and deep through your nose, filling your stomach up with air like it's a balloon. Fill it all the way up. And then exhale through your nose, letting your belly fall, eventually squeezing your belly button to your spine. Inhale deep again through your nose, long, slow, deep breath, filling your stomach up with air. Fill it all the way up. And exhale through your nose. Once again, long, slow, deep breath, letting your belly fall, eventually squeezing your belly button to your spine. Inhale one more time with that long, slow, deep breath through your nose, filling your stomach up with air. Fill it all the way up. And exhale through your nose, long, slow, deep breath, letting your belly fall, eventually squeezing your belly button to your spine. Now you all can just breathe on your own at a nice natural pace. Don't put any effort into it. Just make sure you're breathing in and out through your nose. And the first part of this practice is to focus on how the breath feels. And what I mean by that, with every inhale, you want to feel that air enter through your nose and spread throughout your body on that inhale. And you also want to feel the rising of the belly on that inhale. And on the exhale, you want to feel the belly fall. Feel the air exit your body out through your nostrils. That's all we're going to pay attention to, is how the body feels. You're not going to pay attention to how your clothes feel on your body or how your bottom feels on the chair. All we want to feel is the rising and falling of the belly and the air entering and exiting our nostrils on that inhale and exhale. And if something does pop up and distract you, that's just the nature of the mind. Don't beat yourself up, just acknowledge it, whether it's a thought, sound, or sensation. And then settle yourself back with the breath. And once again, how the breath feels, the air entering through our nose on the inhale, the rising of the belly on the inhale, and on that exhale, the falling of the belly, and the air exiting our body out through our nostrils. That's all we're paying attention to, is how the breath feels. All right, next, we're going to pay attention to how the breath sounds. No matter how loud or how soft the sound is that your breath makes, that's all we're going to pay attention to, is how your individual breath sounds. And see if you can pay attention to it. If you pay close enough attention, you can notice that your inhale sounds a little different than your exhale. But once again, that's all we're going to pay attention to, is how the breath sounds. And, just like in life, distractions can arise. We're not in a cave meditating, we're in our homes or in our offices, and, sounds can arise. If you do get distracted with the sound, once again, that's just the nature of the human mind. Acknowledge that sound, let it pass, anchor yourself back with the breath. And then once again, we're paying attention to how the breath sounds, no matter how soft or how loud your breath is. All we're doing is paying attention to the sound of the breath, and try to pay attention once again to the difference between the inhale and the difference between the exhale. They're two totally different sounds. All right, lastly, we're going to focus our mind on the breath. And the way that we're going to do that is by feeling and hearing the breath at the same time. Once again, we're feeling on that inhale, the rising of the belly, the air entering our body through our nostrils and spreading throughout. On that exhale, we're feeling the falling of our belly, and we're feeling the air exit our body out through our nostrils. And we're also paying attention to how that breath sounds. So once again, pay attention to the sound that it makes on that inhale. Pay attention to the sound that it makes on that exhale. So we're paying attention to the feeling and the sound of the breath. That's how we focus our mind on the breath. And if a thought does pop up, once again, just have patience with yourself. That's just, the nature of the mind. Having thoughts and distractions arise. If they do arise, just acknowledge it. Don't fight with it. Let it pass naturally. And when it does pass, anchor yourself back to the breath. And once again, focusing our mind on the breath by listening to the breath and feeling the breath, the rising and falling of the belly, the air entering and exiting our body through our nostrils, and the sound of the breath, no matter how loud or how soft it is. That's all we're going to pay attention to, is focusing our mind on the breath by listening and feeling. All right, if your eyes are closed, we can keep them closed, and we're going to slowly bring ourselves away from the breath and back to our bodies. So we can start off just by wiggling our toes and our fingers. We can roll our ankles and our wrists. You can do a neck roll both ways just to stretch your neck out a little bit. And, whenever you get ready, no rush, but you can slowly blink your eyes open and come back to your senses whenever you get ready. And, once again, the beauty about this practice is that it's a tool that stays with you forever. Our Jewish godmother, Sharon Salzberg, she always talks about how the breath is portable. So you have this tool with you at all times to help you achieve inner peace, or like Tara was talking about, getting back to that baseline. And I'll pass it off to Ali.
All right, so good morning, everybody. Thank you all for having us. I'm going to talk a little bit about the work the Holistic Life Foundation does and how we've been showing people how to heal their trauma for the past 21 years, like Ottman said. Our focus is here in Baltimore, but we do programs, trainings, speaking engagements all around the world. I think when we first started this work back in early 2002, we kind of, I don't know, I think we thought kids were just bad. Like, there were a lot of kids with a lot of behavior problems. And then once we got to know the kids that we were working with in Baltimore City public schools, I think it was one of those things where we realized there was a lot going on in these kids' homes that was deeper than just a behavior issue. Fast forward a little bit, people started talking about trauma and what trauma was. And it all started to click and make sense. Like Dr. Tara was saying, there's like, when somebody's been traumatized, their body goes into survival mode, and a lot of that happens in their brain. Their prefrontal cortex is hypoactive and becomes inaccessible. Their amygdala becomes hyperactive. So the part of the brain that triggers fight or flight responds too strongly most of the time in a disproportionate amount to the amount of danger that's present. And I'll talk about prefrontal cortex and executive function in a second, but like Dr. Tara was mentioned about people being able to go from that stress state to that relaxed state, a lot of people do get caught in sympathetic dominance or that stress state. They can't get to parasympathetic dominance, that relaxed state. When they're caught in sympathetic dominance, those cortisol levels that she was talking about was very high. Like people get ulcers. That adrenaline that's constantly flowing stimulates the amygdala, and we were just talking about that, increases the blood pressure. So there's a lot of things that go on physically in your body that are slowly killing you. Prefrontal cortex is where executive function lives. And that's why we're seeing those behavior issues in the students that we were working with. Increased impulsivity, decreased emotional control, decreased self-awareness. All these things happen when you don't have access to your prefrontal cortex and your brain is in survival mode. Your vagus nerve. Ottman was thinking about doing a breathing exercise with you all, but we thought you all might get more out of a breath meditation. But there are breathing exercises that help stimulate people's vagus nerve. The vagus nerve it doesn't function properly when people have been highly traumatized, and that deals with threat perception and communication between your mind and body. So, somebody might see something as a threat that's not really a threat, and then without the connection between their mind and body, they might act impulsively and like strike someone or do something. Like we've had kids that, might be walking down the hall in a school, someone's walking too close to them, they hit the kid, and we pull them to the side, we're asking what's going on, why are they doing this? And they're like, I don't know. Again, back in the day, it might be one of those things where we thought the kids were just being bad, quote unquote bad. But it's a trauma response. They saw this as a threat. Their body responded with striking that person, and it's all due to that vagus nerve. A lot of what we do is about making the body a safe space. Like Dr. Tara mentioned, neuroplasticity is a real thing. I remember back in the day, people used to think like their brain was one way and it never changed. But the things that you repeat physically and mentally are the way that you rewire your brain. So if you spend your time being positive, working on being calm and relaxed, that's the way your brain will rewire itself. But you can also, responding with anger and violence and being stressed out all the time, you can wire your brain that way as well. So it depends on the skills that you have and the things that are around you that are going to show how you actually rewire your brain. Big thing I was talking about earlier was making the body a safe space. Dr. Bessel van der Kolk wrote the book, The Body Keeps the Score. He always talks about trauma is being stored in the body but affects the brain. We always say the issues in the tissues. Like you have to figure out a way to make the body a safe space before you can move forward. Proprioceptive input is the body's ability to receive input through the skin, the joints, the muscles, and send that to the brain. Plays a huge role in self-regulation. When people are traumatized, that message is constantly fear. So imagine your body constantly sending your mind a fear message. It puts you in a state of like hypervigilance all the time. And the great thing about the physical yoga practice is you get those moments of peace where you feel safe. So like when you're in the present moment with the practice, your mind isn't caught in that traumatic event sending that fear signal, like you actually feel safe. And slowly over time, like the kids' bodies become a safe, and adults too, their bodies become a safe space, and then they can start to heal their mind too. If you notice Ottman's meditation, there were no blank spaces in the meditation. It was all like kind of just flowing. And that's key when you're working with traumatized people, whether they're kids or adults. A lot of time people, like we've had people come to say, hey, I did a mindfulness meditation with a group, and some of the kids came out crying. And, leaving people in silence can be very scary for someone who's been through a traumatic situation. It's like that empty space allows the trauma to come up. So that's why Ottman kind of guided you all through. You learn mental stillness, you learn inner peace, but it's a safe, protected space, not that vacuum where all that trauma can come up. We've done studies with Johns Hopkins and Penn State on the effectiveness of the practices. So we've honed our skills. We have results to back them. And like I said, we focus in Baltimore, but we do stuff around the world. I'm going to turn it back over to Zeke. I just wanted to give a little synopsis of what we do with the Holistic Life Foundation.
Thank you so much to Ali, Ottman, Dr. Tara, for the great work that you all are doing. I will just note, and I said so in the chat, but these folks are truly world famous. You may have caught them recently on Good Morning America. They just released a book and have been featured literally all over the world, including many cities throughout the United States. And it is a joy and an honor to get to have them as part of our trainings for city government. I'm going to wrap and conclude really quickly, but just to kind of summarize, look, we know that trauma not only impacts your brain, but your body as well. And that the more exposure that young people have to it, the more likely they are to not only suffer mental health challenges, but also physical health challenges as well. It's been shown to literally take years off of a person's life, the more adverse childhood experiences they go through. It increases your likelihood to get cancer, blood and heart conditions, addiction has been linked to high exposure to trauma. And then also you are more likely to be either a perpetrator or a victim of violence the higher your ACE or adverse childhood experience score is as a kid. And so it is truly a disease that we all need to work on healing from. The good news, as Tara and Ali and Ottman said, is that we know through studying the brain, through neuroplasticity, that folks can physically and mentally heal from trauma. That the way our brains are constructed means that just because you've been through it doesn't mean you are doomed to be a traumatized person whose life expectancy will be dramatically shorter. But it does mean that this is an urgent issue that we need to work on. And again, I'm proud that Baltimore is the first city in America to have legislated, to have passed a law to make sure all of our city government is working together on this. I sincerely appreciate all that you all do at the Baltimore Women's Giving Circle in supporting many great organizations that, while they may not call it trauma-informed care, are absolutely addressing this issue. And again, really, really appreciate the space and the opportunity to present with my good friends, and look forward to any questions and comments and working with you all moving forward.
Thank you, Zeke and Ali and Ottman and Dr. Tara. That was really wonderful. And we have a few minutes for questions. There are several in the chat, so I will go back to, let's see, sorry about that. We're all the way down. There was one, please comment on EMDR therapy for trauma.
So I'll just start and then would happy to pass it off to any of my friends. So So EMDR is sort of a developing, but it is a developing practice, but has shown some really interesting high net results so far. And it has to do, and I'm going to pass it to my friends who are more expert, but it has to do with eye movements and rapid eye movements. It's interesting. I think Ali Ottman and myself just had a conversation with Ashley Biden, who is the president's daughter, who's also a social worker, about work that she's interested in doing in Philadelphia and work that we've been doing here in Baltimore. And she actually brought up EMDR as something that has both personally worked in her practice, but also that she's seeing some great results. And so thinking about how does it get merged in, I would say that I think it has a ton of potential. I think the science is still developing. And I think that it is one of those things where as we continue to build our efficacy and resiliency within city government here, it is something that we are thinking about and actively exploring. We start with mindfulness and restorative practices, which are both really evidence-based and have a strong foundation of research behind them. And we are fortunate to have some of the best in the world teaching it. But I actually really do think that EMDR is something that we, need to pay increasing attention to, and really appreciate the question. And any of the other folks, if you have any thoughts on that as well.
The only thing I'll add to that is that EMDR, so it is a eye movement therapy. So it's one of the healing modalities to support survivors of trauma. And so your therapist will move their hand or move an object, and so have the person concentrate on that object or their finger to recall and help the body calm down. So very similar to mindfulness, you have to be in a mindful state to practice it. And where its theoretical framework comes from is the understanding that the brain, the understanding that the brain, the mind, and the person are three separate entities, right? Your brain is an organ, just like all of your other organs. Your mind is your thoughts and your belief systems, and then you are how you interpret those events. And so EMDR honors and recognizes that the brain processes memories differently based on whether or not they are traumatic or whether or not they are happy. And so, for example, if I were to ask you all, so just if you all can utilize your Zoom chat or something, how many of us have ever been in love or really strong like before? How many of us have ever had a mutual crush? Okay, me and Carol, that's it. Okay, some more people. Okay, great, there we go. If not, Valentine's Day is coming, get someone up, right? So I see many of you smiling, right? Your body is automatically taking you back to that mutual crush, right? Many of you smiled. I don't know if some of you saw your body language, some of you relaxed in your chairs, right? You all could remember. Now tell me everything you liked about this person. You would, and they did this, and they did this, and they did this, and and so the memory flows. If we were to ask someone to remember something that's traumatic, which is why in my teaching and practice, you never have to bring up the trauma, right? You never have to bring it up. One, because many people don't remember it, but the way that the brain remembers it, like Ali said, through that fight, flight, or freeze complex. So as I'm retelling the story, my brain is actually having me think that I'm there. So there are gaps within that memory. And so in those gaps within the memory, the person may be experiencing what we call triggers, or what I call like really indicators for self-care, right? That, the brain is getting too activated, it needs to calm down, right? The brain is getting too activated, it needs to calm down. And so EMDR is one of the tools that is used to help people be able to recall events in a way that allows the brain to kind of reach this baseline of homeostasis during that recall. So the brain is not stopped in these gap periods of fight, flight, or freeze that allow symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder to come up. So post-traumatic stress disorder, just a really quick definition, because oftentimes, Ali and I don't know if you all find this too, people will use phrases or words without really the definition of it. And so when we think about PTSD in a very literal sense, it's the brain not being able to distinguish what has happened in the past versus what is happening now. And so the brain is transported back to that event because there's that gap there in that social emotional development. And so it is occurring now, even though it's an event that has happened in the past. And I've been triggered or I've received an indicator that there's a self-care practice needed in order for me to continue. And Ali and Atman, I didn't know if you wanted to add anything. Okay. Okay.
That was terrific.
Yeah,
That is why Tara is Dr. Tara, and I am just a lowly elected official. Yeah, thank you for that.
So we have another question. Are the police trained to recognize the symptoms of trauma and how to handle it?
Yeah, so great question. Thank you for that. So short answer is yes. Longer answer is it's a little bit complicated. So part of the consent decree, which we entered into with the Department of Justice, mandated that police, of course, change some of the unconstitutional patterns and practices that they were exhibiting that were lifted up in the DOJ report and that, of course, kind of culminated in the death of Freddie Gray in police custody. Part of what the consent decree mandates that the police do is become trained in identifying trauma. And I'll say this, a few things. One, police officers often are some of the most highly exposed to trauma people in our communities. They get asked to go out and deal with folks who are in hyperarousal, fight or flight, who are just at their absolute worst selves. That is a police officer's daily activity every single day. And you can't help but absorb some of that toxic stress yourself when you are constantly going out into scenes that are chaotic, violent, and often out of control, and you're being asked to be the one to reassert control. I'm of the belief that some of the issues that we see both in Baltimore and nationally really could be improved if police were better trained. Now, that doesn't solve the issue of implicit bias, which we know also contributes to negative interactions between officers and communities of color. But it is to say that I think for a lot of our police officers, being able to recognize in your own body when you are being triggered, when you are going into that fight or flight mode, and being able to count to 3, being able to take deep breaths, is really important, because if you can't do it yourself, how can you help other people do it? So it has been a big push for me working with Police Commissioner Michael Harrison. I will say it is a work in progress. One of the other things that I'm actually really excited about is I have a meeting conversation tomorrow with our new state's attorney, Ivan Bates. He has expressed interest in getting his staff at the state's attorney's office trained in trauma-informed care. And when we think particularly about victim services, which has been a real challenge in our city, but how are we treating victims of violence? To me, it is incredibly important that the legal system all around, from the judges to the lawyers to the police officers, that everybody understands and has at least a baseline understanding of the impact of trauma so that we don't make the problem worse. But short answer is yes, police are working on this.
Zeke, we have one more question. It is 10:31 and we want to be mindful of your time and the time of our other participants. So would you like to end this here? Do you have time to take one more question?
I got time for the Women's Giving Circle. I'm always here for it. Sure.
The question, Wendy Davis asks, are you involved with the local school systems to train teachers in how to de-escalate situations? And are there teachers trained to understand trauma and its effects on their students?
Yeah, so I'm going to just speak briefly and then turn it over to Ali and Atman, who have done some great work with city schools through the Holistic Life Foundation. Again, the short answer is yes. The longer answer is, as always, it's complicated. Unfortunately, both the police department and the Baltimore City public school system are not considered city agencies. They have their own autonomous school board, and the police is still a state agency. You can read all about that in today's Baltimore Sun. So we can't directly legislate them, but what we have done is worked with educators, principals, and others on these practices, particularly around restorative practices. Baltimore was one of the original cities to implement restorative practices, and someone who is not here, but who's been a huge part of this work is Karen Weber, who is at Open Society Foundations. She had been the head of education programming at Open Society Institute, and now she leads the innovation team for the International Open Society Foundations, but she had been a principal in Baltimore, and she had seen that in order to be effective, you have to be able to understand trauma, you have to be able to de-escalate tense situations, you have to teach conflict resolution and be really explicit about it. So she, as this incredible pioneer, was able to get restorative practices into I think 28 of our schools. The Johns Hopkins School of Education and University of Maryland Carey Law School did a big study. They found a 40% reduction in suspensions for the schools that underwent this training. They saw improved culture and climate. And so that is work that continues and that we are continuing to push. Last night, I was on a Ed Twitter chat Zoom thing where that was the topic, is coming out of this pandemic where we know everyone's mental health has been impacted, but particularly our children who are already living in situations where they experience high exposure to ACEs and trauma. We know that no one is doing well. And so we know we need to double down and really triple down on getting effective, restorative, healing-centered practices throughout our schools. And so we do get to work and push with teachers and others who have been just incredibly receptive. And I'll just pass it to Ali and Atman, who I know have done great work through Holistic Life with city schools.
Yeah, so thanks, Zeke. So we do train the teachers that we work with in trauma-informed practices and how to identify trauma and how to de-escalate situations. I think that the key is that it's not district-wide, so it may be the schools that we're working in. The students are benefiting and the teachers are benefiting. The school community is benefiting, but I think it would be a lot better if we could get this where it's in all the schools, so it's helping all the teachers and helping all the students, because the teachers are dealing with high levels of secondary trauma. People wonder why teachers burn out so quickly in Baltimore. It's because they don't know how to take care of themselves in healthy ways. You know what I mean? Like, you might have coping skills that you use, but I think if people had things that where they could actually have healthy skills to kind of reduce their stress level, burn off that secondary trauma, and just take care of themselves, I think we'd be able to keep a lot of our teachers a lot longer.
Yeah, and when we go into schools, we always start off with the teachers. And, you know, when we do teach them, you know, about yoga and mindfulness, we teach them a lot of neuroscience. But, you know, as far as practices, we teach them stuff for self-care. And it's all about practicality of the practices. So, like, you know, when the teachers come into school, they have breathing practices to do to kind of get themselves grounded and present so they can be 100% there and receptive for their students. And like Ali said, they accumulate secondary trauma during their school day. We give them practices to kind of de-escalate and get grounded before they go home and are dealing with their loved ones. You know, so we teach them about trauma and definitely self-care to help prevent burnout.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you all so much for being with us today. This was a wonderful program. We're really grateful. And also a special thank you to Ann Daniels, who stepped up early this morning to admin this meeting. It ran a lot smoother than it would have if I was doing that. So thank you, Ann. We really appreciate it. So thank you all. I think there's some contact information embedded in the original invite, if you want to reach out to anybody who participated in the program today. Thank you.
Thanks so much for having us. Appreciate you.
I just want to let everyone know that this has been recorded and that our communications committee
we'll post it on our YouTube channel if you want to share it with anybody, because it's got wonderful, wonderful information. Thank you, Tara, Zeke, Ali, Atman. You were amazing and wonderful.
Thank you.
Thank you. Have a great day, everyone.
Thank you.